Hey folks, welcome to the RAMROD Training Series nutrition discussion. I am Rick Duong. I'm with the RCC Redmond Cycling Club board. We're here to talk about nutrition. I'll let folks introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Kathie?
Hi, I'm Dr. Kathie Beals, and I am a um, sports dietitian. Probably been practicing in the field for about 40 years, 35, 40 years as a sports dietitian. And in addition, I am a teaching professor at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.
Okay. Hi, I'm Pamela Austin. I'm was on the board of Redmond Cycling Club. Been cycling since my kids were old enough that I could get out of the house, and recreational cyclist, but I enjoy doing long distance cycling. I've done Ramrod 8 times, one day SGP and a Grand Fondo or two, and learned how to eat on the bike on my own. So I think this will be an interesting discussion.
Hi, I'm Warren Eamon. I've been cycling since my teens, back in college, and you see that's quite a bit older now. Yes, I've done RAMROD several times, and this year I am leading the RAMROD Training Series. So this should be good for both the training series and for RAMROD itself.
For folks that are coming to us and don't know what RAMROD is, it's a ultra distance event in the Pacific Northwest. It circumnavigates Mount Rainier. It's generally 150 miles with about 10,000 feet worth of climbing. You're spending several hours in the saddle. Physical training is one of the aspects that we're concentrating on with Oren and the Rod and Rod training series, but also from a nutrition perspective, is as you're spending so many hours on the bicycling, nutrition is so important in terms of having an enjoyable event. So really what we want to do is just, let's have a discussion about nutrition. What are the things folks should be looking for, things to keep in mind, and hello. Things that people should be aware of in terms of how to better make the experience for them or make it more of an enjoyable experience. Just as a caveat as well, this is really for discussion purposes, is for entertainment purposes. Everyone's individual, so some of the topics and things we may recommend here, please consult your professional or your physician as well. So just to make sure that the recommendations that we're giving you or we're talking about is not solely recommendations, but consult your professional. I'll hand it over in terms of Kathie. It's like, Kathie, you talked about a little bit about your background. Can you talk about a little bit more about like nutrition, how nutrition is important with an event such as Ramrod?
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about why nutrition is important in general. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen just because I have such a beautiful slide there that I want to share for you. And one of the things that I often tell people is that, when it comes to gearing up for any sort of athletic competition, you've got the physical training. And people really focus heavily on the physical training. And not to take anything away from you, Oren, because physical training is super important. But what I always say is that nutrition is as important, if not more important, than the physical training, because you cannot physically get on the bike and put in the miles if you haven't fueled your body properly. So making sure that you are fueled properly when you launch your training program is so important, because you're not going to be able to complete that physical training unless you have the fuel in your body to do so. So that's sort of my caveat right there.
So as we look at Ramrod is occurring usually in the July timeframe, and for people that are looking at the recording, we're looking at March. How much time do you think folks should start looking at kind of a nutrition plan when they're looking at training like this?
I would answer your question with a question. When are you going to start training? Because the day you start training is the day you should start looking at your nutrition. Your physical training and your nutrition go hand in hand. And just as you're creating your training program, your nutrition program should match that training program. And so you want to make sure that you are fueling your body appropriately every single day you go out and train. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I think when we look at kind of the different topics we were going to discuss, one of the things that we're kicking off now is the RAMROD Training Series. What we really wanted to kind of have discussion with the folks is like, how do you kind of align your nutrition plan with the physical training that's required for it? Again, with our RAMROD Training Series, we look at the increasing mileage, increasing elevations over time so that you can build up your physical training to complete something like the RAMROD. And I think what you're saying here is you want to match the nutrition plan based accordingly as well.
Absolutely. And so I'm gonna pull up another slide here real quick. And so again, in order to perform, whether it's training or the actual race itself, that is RAMROD, you have to be fueled properly. It's not unlike if you're going to head off on a road trip in your car, right? It's like you could have your tires checked, you know, you can make sure that your tires are full of air and you changed your oil and all of your belts are adjusted and your steering is aligned and your car is ready to go. But if you don't stop at the gas station and fill up your tank, it doesn't matter. You're not going anywhere. And that's probably the best analogy to provide you of how important it is that you are fueling appropriately to match your training. And so we eat food to fuel our performance. And when we think about the food that's fueling our performance, we know that the macronutrients are carbs, proteins, and fats. And when it comes to fueling cycling performance or really any endurance performance, but since we're talking here about cycling, the most important nutrient is carbohydrate. It is the most important. And I guess I would just pause for a minute and have anybody that's listening to the podcast, and including those of you, Rick, Pamela, and Oren, to take a look at these and ask yourself, have you ever felt any of these? Have you ever experienced any of these symptoms right here? Early fatigue during workouts, feeling of heavy legs. How many of you have gone off on a ride and your legs feel really heavy? You know, you feel like every time you're turning over the pedal, it's like, oh, it's work. Not recovering as quickly as you should. Even though you're training, your performance is not improving. In fact, it's either staying the same or your performance might actually be declining despite trying to ramp up your training. Lack of focus and concentration during work or, you know, when you're spending time with families. Lack of motivation. You're just like, oh, I have to go get on the bike today and I'm just not feeling it. If you're a female of childbearing age, are you having menstrual irregularities, or you're getting frequent illnesses or injuries, things that you just can't seem to get past? All of those are signs of suboptimal fueling. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of fueling properly. And again, the macronutrients, the energy providing macronutrients, those nutrients that provide calories, and we use calories interchangeably with energy in nutrition, are listed right here, with carbohydrate being the most important. And so you'll see carbohydrate recommendations in terms of a percentage, and that is a percentage of your total calories. But when it comes to prescribing carbohydrates for athletes, we use a gram per kilogram of body weight. And so you need to be able to first convert your weight in pounds to kilograms, which is pounds divided by 2.2. And then the range is 6 to 9 grams per kilogram of body weight. And we use a range because, again, the goal is to match your nutrition to your training. So on days that you're doing a shorter duration ride or a lower intensity ride, your carbohydrate needs would be down at the lower end of the range. On the days that you're doing a higher intensity or a longer duration ride, your needs would be at the higher end of the range. On the day that you're actually doing the ride, it would probably be even higher than the 9 grams per kilogram. But I gave it, this was more of a range for early to mid training for RAMROD. So carbs are going to be the focus. Absolutely.
Yeah,
so, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rick.
No, go ahead. There's a couple of interesting things that I think you've listed there is you're kind of breaking up the training necessary or nutrition that's required for training, but also the nutrition that's required for actual the day of the ride. I think, I mean, if you look at those lists that you mentioned, it's like, yes, I think I've experienced a lot of the symptoms of low nutrition. I think, I mean, personally for me is I think I've always concentrated more on race day or ride day or carb loading beforehand. But I think what you're saying in this case is the time frame leading up to the ride and the training rides that you go on time needs to be properly fueled.
Yes, yes. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of athletes make is they tend to sort of skip over nutrition while they're training and put all their focus on race day. But if you haven't prepared, that would be the equivalent would be, I'm not going to physically train for the ride. I'm just going to go out and do it and hope for the best. Right. So, I mean, it just is I mean, you have to think of nutrition as another aspect of your training. And it is as important, and I'm biased because I'm a sports dietitian, but I'm also an athlete, so I get it. But you have to think of the nutrition piece of your training as just as important as the physical piece. And the goal is to match that nutrition piece to the training piece. And there's a term that we use in nutrition called carbohydrate availability. And what that means is exactly how it sounds. We all know what the term availability means, that it's ready, it's there. And so you want to think about making sure that you've got plenty of carbohydrates on the days that you're training hard. And then you can worry less about carbohydrates on your rest days or the days that you're not training, right? So that's sort of the concept of carbohydrate availability. And you mentioned, Rick, you mentioned carbohydrate loading. Carbohydrate loading is archaic. We don't do it anymore. In sports nutrition, it's all about making sure that you've been fueling your body while you're training. And then what we used to call carbohydrate loading is, I mentioned that this range is more for the training purposes. The day before and the day of, you might be 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight that day. But it's not so much carbohydrate loading, is back to that term of carbohydrate availability. We want to up our carb intake on that day because we want to have those carbs available on the day that we need them.
So question about carbohydrate, the loading piece, which you said is archaic. And then, so you're talking about availability. So on a ride day, you would have a heavy carb breakfast and also then have a lot of carbs available on your bike.
Yes. So let me show you.
Keep it going throughout. You start heavy and then keep it going through the day then?
Yes, yes. And so let me show you this slide and orientate you a little bit, and this will help answer your question too, Pam. So let's look at this diagram on the right. So one of the reasons that we as sports dietitians focus on carbs, especially for endurance training and for anything that is considered aerobic or endurance, such as training for RAMROD, is that when you are actually exercising, your muscles are contracting, the fuel that's being utilized, especially in the moderate to high intensity areas, are carbohydrates. So if you look at this, here's the percent of carbohydrate contribution to the total fuel that's used during exercise. And this is your exercise intensity. Now, I would argue that most of the individuals training for RAMROD are rarely going to ever be in this low. I mean, this is like walking to the refrigerator. So most cyclists are going to be here and here, especially when you're on a climb, right? Yep. So I love this graph because it highlights the importance of carbohydrates. You can see the percent of contribution for most individuals, even riding at a moderate intensity, half of what you're burning is carbohydrates. So you really need to focus on that. What is the other half of what you're burning? Well, it's fats. Why don't we focus so much on fat? Because when you look at what we can store in our bodies, we have about, I would say about 2,000 calories worth of stored carbohydrate on a good day. We can burn through that very quickly. Whereas even lean individuals have hundreds of thousands of calories of stored fat. We're not going to burn through that. So we focus on carbohydrates because we utilize them so heavily during training and competition, and we have a pretty high likelihood of depleting them. And if we deplete them, then we're forced, and you've probably all felt what that feels like when you deplete carbohydrates. We call it hitting the wall. It's no fun. So that's why we focus so heavily. So in answer to your question, Pam, this is another chart that I love because it highlights, it puts everything that we talk about as sports dietitians into one nice table. So here we have daily needs, and this gets at this idea of carbohydrate availability. So on light training days, you might need only 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. Moderate, high, very high. So it highlights the fact that you want to consume the appropriate amount of carbohydrate relative to the intensity and duration of the training that you're doing that day, as well as the competition. So maybe, you know, you mentioned a Grand Fondo, Pam. So maybe you're going out to do an hour and a half Grand Fondo ride, right? So maybe it's like a 40K. And so that would be more in the realm of moderate. You wouldn't need a high carbohydrate intake that day. But when you do the RAMROD, and I'm assuming that it's taking most people more than 5 hours to do that, you want to be up here. Okay. Now, this is a high amount of carbohydrate to do, and you're going to have days where you're going to be training probably 8-9 hours. So those are days that you're going to be up in this higher category. It's also going to give your gut a chance to experience what those higher carb intakes throughout the day are going to be like, right? So you're not doing it all the first time on very important race day. And then down here, you've got sort of some guidelines for what to do during, so pre-event, during exercise, and that type of thing. And I've got some other slides that sort of highlight that. Does that help answer your question, Pam?
Right, because you're talking about availability. So if I have a bagel in the morning and I don't know, some other carb, that will last me for a while. And then I need to start supplementing on the bike.
Yes.
So I can't just rely on a heavy carb breakfast to take me through the day.
No. And again, keeping in mind that we store carbohydrates as glycogen in our liver and in our muscles. And we do have a limited capacity to do that. So even if you have a really nice substantial breakfast, there's a limit to how much carbohydrate you can store. And it's about 2,000 to 2,500 calories, maybe a little bit more. So you can think about, and if you have a Garmin, if you ever, you know, look at your calorie expenditure on the bike, you probably realize that there are times when you're expending more than 2,000 calories on the bike. Mm-hmm. So keeping in mind that not all of that is carbs, but you have to sort of get in that mindset of there is a likelihood that I'm going to deplete my glycogen stores on the bike. And that's what you don't want to do. So having a fueling well before you go out on your ride is going to be important. But if your ride is long enough, and if you just go out for an hour ride, then you probably don't need to worry about consuming anything during the ride, as long as you have fueled beforehand. But if you're going to go long enough to where there's a potential to deplete glycogen, then you do need to fuel. And I'll give you this example. So as we're talking, I'm thinking about all these great slides I probably should have added in here. But when we're working with athletes in a lab, so when I'm doing a research study in the lab, and I want to, let's say I'm interested in how a particular nutritional strategy is going to affect performance. And so I want to actually deplete glycogen in my subjects. The glycogen depleting protocol in the lab is an hour and a half of, usually it's on a bike ergometer, so a stationary bike, an hour and a half at about 75% of VO2 max. That is the glycogen depleting ride. So put that into your head of when you go out on the road. How often do you go out for at least an hour and a half at 75% of your VO2 max. And that's a good rule of thumb to think, am I glycogen depleting? That's the glycogen depletion protocol. And you won't completely deplete glycogen, but you will deplete it low enough to where you'll see a negative effect on performance.
There's a bunch of information. I just wanted to see if I can kind of unravel here. So a couple of things is I love the I would say the frame of mind and or frame set in terms of the expectations of RAMROD. It's Pam, do you want to talk about RAMROD in terms of your experience? Like what is RAMROD? What the ride is like from a climbing perspective?
Well, I mean, you start at 5 o'clock in the morning, with the best breakfast you can get when you're staying in a hotel room. And, how did I ride? I brought 13, 14 hours and 3 major climbs, so 10,000 feet. So part of it's well supported, but I think it's also important to make sure that you have your own nutrition along the way. But it's a long day, and always, I think a new rider is afraid of bonking and eating properly. That's a huge thing as a new rider. I know when I wanted to do RAMROD, and I'd be asking people, and they said you need to learn how to eat on the bike.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is really key to figuring out how to eat on the bike and get those carbs. But the climbs are pretty intense. You're climbing for a long, long time.
There are a couple of climbs again from a perspective side. It's some of these are beyond category climbs. If you look like the Tour de France, like if you're climbing from Ashford into up to Inspiration Point, that is at least what 4,000 feet over like 12 miles. If you're there's a Cayuse Pass if we're going the counterclockwise direction. I think there's 3 mountain passes that folks are going through. So in a sense, like you can't cheat
Yeah.
the carbs, right? It's like, yes, you want to make sure you go slow enough where you're in from intensity perspective. You don't go on the red zone, but yeah, in a sense, there's no way to cheat the intensity. Again, just trying to separate what's available for you during ride times. But as you mentioned, Kathie, like from a nutrition perspective, I think one of the key things you mentioned is, I guess for me personally, it's trying to quote unquote lose weight on the bike before training. Obviously, if you're climbing, you want to climb with the less amount of weight as you can. But I think what I've done is sometimes I've gone on those training rides where I'm not eating anything, right? It's like I'm trying to lose weight, trying to get the lowest weight possible, not eating anything through the training ride, but I'm assuming that I'm paying that forward from a training perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that, and I've worked with actually a lot of cyclists that are in a similar mindset as you are, Rick. And I think you have to, again, you have to think in terms of carbohydrate availability. And you also have to think of, what am I going to sacrifice? Am I going to sacrifice power output? Am I going to sacrifice a training stimulus in order to try and burn calories to lose weight? So I think there are certain rides that you could probably get away with not fueling. I'm going to say over fueling. But I think you want to be careful with, if I'm going to go out, let's say that I'm going out for an 8-hour ride and I'm not going to eat anything that whole time so I can try to burn calories, right? You're going to sacrifice a training stimulus, because what's going to happen is after 2 hours of riding at a moderate intensity, you're going to glycogen deplete. And when you do that, what that means is that you're going to have to, it's kind of like if there's no gas in the tank, you're going to have to slow your intensity down or decrease your intensity and slow your pace down to a point where carbohydrates aren't going to play a role as your fuel source. And so what you're sacrificing is the training stimulus to try and burn some calories. So that's where you sort of have to make the decision. Now, can you on some shorter rides where you're going to do a lower intensity anyways, not consume carbs and get away with that? Probably. But what I typically do with cyclists is I say, okay, let's look at a week and say, where are your rides where you're going to maybe try to do some tempo riding or a longer duration. So we really want to focus on that training stimulus. Let's make sure that we've got adequate carbohydrate availability on those days. And then on our recovery rides or on our shorter duration, lower intensity rides, then we can play a little bit with lower carbohydrate availability because we won't sacrifice the training stimulus. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I think again, more from a, I guess, a time frame perspective, we are, several months outside of Ramrod. Is if a person was looking to reduce weight, could they do it during this nutrition or this training period, or do they want to do it in like the off season, or in a sense, like how do you recommend if someone wanted to lose weight, what's the best way to do that?
I think you can do it in the early training season. I wouldn't try to do it in the later part of the training season. So typically we recommend weight loss during the off season and or during the early training season. But once you start ramping up intensity and duration, if you're going to try to lose weight at the same time, you are going to sacrifice the training stimulus. So, and again, the other thing you have to think about is where are you intending to train and where are you intending to compete, right? When you're doing the RAMROD, where are you going to be? And so, if you're planning to train and compete way down here, then we can probably play a little bit more with carbohydrate availability. But if you're trying to train and compete more up here, it's going to be harder.
Yeah, also for folks is as a disclaimer, Ramrod is not a race, it is a ride. So in a sense, you go at your own pace. Again, one of the things we wanted to do in this series is make it more enjoyable for folks. You can get into a habit of trying to chase the person in front of you when you're climbing up these mountains, but it is a self-paced ride. So in a sense, go at your own pace. I want to talk about just like more like, types of carbohydrates. Are there specific types of food that you would recommend in terms of nutrition, in terms of density, in terms of palatability, I would say in this case?
Look at this picture right up here. So, yeah. So, when you're talking about carbohydrates, you want to look for the most wholesome, nutrient dense. That's a term that we use all the time. And nutrient dense just means the most nutrients per calorie. So nutrient dense carbs. And when it comes to food groups, you're looking at fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Those are the carbs you want to focus on.
What about, you mentioned like for you're looking at carbohydrate availability as kind of the main strategy, but how does fats and proteins play in terms of diet?
Yeah.
Time period?
So I have a slide on that. So the reason that I focus on carbs, and so let me just go back here, is again, it's twofold. There's two reasons. One, because it is the primary fuel that's going to be used during training and during competition in endurance events. So that's one of the reasons we focus on carbs. The other reason, because people can argue, well, but fats play an important role too. And again, if you're exercising or training in this moderate intensity, what it doesn't show in this white space is, okay, this is the carbohydrate utilization. What is this white space? Whoops, sorry, let me go back. This white space is fat utilization. So while 50% of what we're burning or utilizing as fuel is carbs, the other 50% is fat. But again, the reason that we focus on carbs is because unlike fat, where we pretty much have unlimited supply, even a fairly lean individual has a lot of fat storage, we don't have an unlimited supply of carbohydrate storage. So that's why we focus on that. Protein, we think of protein, it can be used as fuel, but we don't like to use protein as fuel because protein has a much more important function, and that is to support muscle tissue, development and function, right? So, and if we're having to use protein as a fuel source, then we're basically sacrificing our muscle to use it as a fuel source. So let me stop for a minute and say that then provides us a third reason why carbs are so important. Because people that go on these low carb diets, they're not eating carbs, we still need some carbohydrate. Our brains use glucose almost exclusively. And so if we're not eating carbs, and yet our brains need carbs, where are we getting those carbs? We get it from protein. So protein can be used as a fuel. And it can also be used to make carbohydrate when we don't have carbohydrate. But anytime I'm having to use protein as fuel or to make carbohydrate, I'm sacrificing protein's role in muscle tissue synthesis and function. So we really want to preserve our protein for our muscles.
Do you get, I guess, in the sense of energy storage or energy access, do you get access to protein as fast as you do carbohydrates? For example, like if you're in a sprint or if you're climbing a hill, it's again, this is more from my understanding, it's like you get access to the sugars first versus fats. But the question was more about protein. Is it readily available as carbohydrates?
So before I answer that, let me go back to what you said, that the first sugars first, fat second.
Yeah.
That's actually a myth. And so let me backtrack again. I think because it's a simple way for people to think of it, there's sort of this myth that I burn up carbohydrates first and then I utilize fat. That's not true. Let's say, so for most people that are training, they're in this category. We'll talk about sprinting up a hill, right? And that moves us here, okay? But let's say we're here, where 50% of what we're burning is carbs and 50% is fat. I'm using both. So I don't use up my carbohydrates and then say, okay, I'm done with that. Now let's use the fat, right? The mixture of fuels that I'm using during any training or competition is all about what is the intensity level. So at a moderate intensity, right in here, about half of what I'm using is fat and half is what I'm using is carbohydrate. Now let's say that I'm in the Tour de France and there's a sprint bonus.
Yeah.
Boom. So I sprint, I move up here. What am I burning now? Question to the panel of three. As I sprint into that sprint bonus, what am I doing?
Carbs.
All carbs. And then I settle back in and I'm behind the pellet. I'm behind a nice wall of riders and I can just sort of cruise. Now I'm burning more fat. So the relative mix of fuel has nothing to do with I'm using up this first and then I do this. It's all about what is the intensity. Now, if I completely deplete my glucose, then I'm using fat. But what happens is I can't work here. I've got to move down here. But if I push myself to try to move up into a higher intensity, then I'm going to start converting protein to carbohydrates to try to push up here. But I'm sacrificing body proteins to try to be here.
I guess is the conversion almost, this is again, is it instantaneous or does it take a process?
Gluconeogenesis happens pretty fast. The term is called gluconeogenesis. And if you're a word sleuth, break the word apart. Glucose, new, genesis, to make new glucose. And the primary substrate that I make new glucose from is protein. I can't make glucose from fat. Wouldn't that be nice? We can't make glucose from fat, but we can make glucose from protein. But when we do that, we're sacrificing body proteins, which is not what we want to do.
And I think what you're saying is in this case is if you are training, you are intensifying the load that you're putting in your body, you're growing muscle, you're sacrificing your gains, your muscle gains in this case from a protein side.
Yep. Yeah. Bummer, huh?
Bummer.
So protein is important. Protein is what's going to help us with our power, right? So we need to make sure we're getting adequate protein. And our protein recommendations, again, are in grams per kilogram of body weight. So here's the range. And so at the early phase of your training season, you'll probably be here, unless you are also trying to lose weight. So you might be in a calorie deficit. And then you would also want to be here in the higher end of the range. So high intensity or prolonged duration, if energy intake is low, if you're messing with your carbohydrate availability, and if you are a vegan, which we can go into another discussion about that, just because there is some a lower bioavailability with plant-based proteins. It's not that you can't meet your requirements, but you want to be a little bit more conscientious there. So the other thing that I like to highlight with protein is this graph here. And this was a study that was done fairly recently. And it looks at how you distribute your protein intake throughout the day. And so the graph on the top is a pretty fair representation of how most people distribute their protein intake throughout the day, right? We don't eat a lot of protein at breakfast. We may bump it up a little bit at lunch. And then dinner is where we tend to have most of our protein. So it's very skewed. And this is a more evenly distributed protein intake throughout the day. And I'll give you the punchline of the study, but basically they showed that muscle protein synthesis was superior when protein intake was more evenly distributed throughout the day, given the same absolute amount of protein than when it was skewed towards dinner. So in sports nutrition, we usually we calculate the amount of protein that a particular athlete requires, and then we try to evenly distribute it throughout the day.
Does that also go in terms of just eating in general? Like you want to take on your calories distributed throughout the day?
Not necessarily. And again, so as a sports dietitian, when I'm working with athletes, I focus more on macronutrient composition. And I think about in protein, we want to evenly distribute it throughout the day. Carbs, we want to focus more on availability around our training bout. We want to make sure, and I don't want to overuse the gas tank and car, but if my car is just sitting in the driveway, it doesn't matter if I have a full tank of gas, right? Who cares? But when I head out for that road trip, I need to make sure I'm well fueled, right? So with carbs, we tend to like to make sure that there's availability around our training session. And then protein, the research seems to indicate that for muscle protein synthesis, it's best to sort of evenly distribute it throughout the day. And there's reasons for that I think will just sort of muddy the waters. So we'll just leave it this.
Okay. Hey, so Oren, I want to talk a little bit about how we're structuring the RAMROD Training Series and see if we can equate that to what Kathie's talking about from a nutrition perspective. Can you kind of talk about the training series that we have going on between now and to the start of RAMROD?
Yes, at the moment the plan is to gradually increase mileage and gradually increase the amount of elevation gain in a ride. And at the moment, we're doing about 50-mile rides and about 2,500 feet of climbing. So they're going to take the average rider, I don't know, 3 to 4 hours to complete. And there's usually a snack stop in the middle, but hardly great. Starbucks isn't going to be great, you know. But it's going to be useful to know what kind of breakfast we should have for these rides. Whether we should just try and involve a better place to stop in the middle, or
Oren,
are these, with you?
So these are group rides, right? So these are as a group.
The riders may elect to ride in groups, but essentially it's you're doing your own ride, which is the same as RAMROD. You're doing your own ride.
Okay.
We're not lining them up and making them all right together. It's not like that at all.
Well, the reason that I asked is I'm looking at timing. So you mentioned, have a good breakfast. So I'm just trying to look to see, are people generally starting out on this training ride in the morning? Are they doing it in the afternoon? Because to talk about how to schedule eating, I sort of need to know what time of the day is this happening? Are they just waking up in the morning, having breakfast and doing the ride? Are they going to be doing the ride after lunch? So that will help me.
Given the mileage, which is gradually increasing up to 100 miles, we start in the morning.
Okay.
So currently I'm starting at 10 a.m., but I'll move them back as the mileage gets longer.
Okay, that's helpful. So one of the things to sort of think about, and sorry, I'm going to keep going back to carbohydrates because it's so important. But so remember that I mentioned that we store glycogen, glycogen in our muscles and our liver. And those two tanks have very different purposes for our bodies. The carbohydrate that we store in our muscle is there to be used by our muscle. And in fact, once it's stored in our muscle, it cannot be used for anything else than the muscle that it's stored in. The carbohydrate that's stored in our liver, that carbohydrate is to support our blood glucose, which ultimately supports our brain. So think of muscle glycogen as carbohydrate for the muscle, liver glycogen as carbohydrate for the brain. Okay, so when you start thinking about training, doing that 4 to 5 hour training ride in the morning, you want to think about actually the night before. So having a good carbohydrate rich dinner the night before, that's going to fill up your muscle glycogen. And when you go to sleep at night, that glycogen in your muscle isn't going anywhere. It's right there. Unless you are a very active sleepwalker and you get up and you run around the block in your sleep, the glycogen that's stored in your muscle from the night before and really the day before, if you were eating all day, that glycogen is still going to be there. When you eat your breakfast, that breakfast is used to sort of top off your muscle glycogen stores. But breakfast, what that's really doing is, if you've eaten well the night before, that breakfast is really supplying your liver glycogen. Because unlike muscle glycogen, which isn't going anywhere overnight, think about the fact that your brain is active while you're sleeping. And so your liver glycogen is being depleted. In fact, they have shown that an 8-hour sleep and your liver glycogen is completely gone. So when you have breakfast in the morning, break the fast, what you're actually assuming that you have replenished muscle glycogen the day before and from dinner the night before, that breakfast is going to serve to sort of top off muscle glycogen. But really, the big role of breakfast is to top off your liver glycogen, restore that. All right. So you want a good breakfast before you head out. And you'll see this right here. Before you want to do between 1 and 4 grams per kilogram, and that of carbohydrate. And that will depend on when you're eating before you're going out. So if you're really good about getting up early and you've got 2 hours before you go off on your training ride, then you would do 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. If you hate getting up in the morning so that you can only get up an hour before you go ride, then it's 1 gram per kilogram. So the rule of thumb is 1 gram, 1 hour before, 2 grams, 2 hours before, 3 grams, 3 hours before. And that's gram per kilogram of body weight, right? So that's what you want to do before you head out on your ride. So think about that. And then here's the during. But I'm not going to go into during until I see if you have any questions on before.
It's interesting what you just mentioned is, I guess, the glycogen stored in the muscle is only allocated for the muscle. So does that mean, like, if I am complete, or if I'm filled with glycogen, but I'm only using my legs in the cycling event. That means the glycogen for my upper body is can't be reutilized for my legs. Interesting.
Nope, nope, nope. Not directly anyways,
Not
no.
directly, but
So-
glycogen in your liver can be distributed.
So
Yeah.
this is so
So, go ahead, Pam.
well, I just kind of take you down this path. So I'm just wondering, so we use our legs very heavily, not our upper body. So as we train, well, our legs then start to begin to accumulate more carbohydrates because they're generally in use.
Yes. So one of the adaptations that happens with training is an increased capacity to store glycogen in the muscle. Your liver glycogen stores can't be significantly increased with training. Your liver is kind of the size of your liver, right? But as you start increasing muscle cell, I would say, what's the word that I'm looking for? I mean, I guess it would be hypertrophy and hyperplasia. As you have more muscle cells and a larger volume of muscle cell, you have a greater capacity to store glycogen in the muscle. So one of the adaptations to endurance training is an increased capacity to store glycogen in the muscle.
That's
So
also why it's
basically,
important. Sorry, go ahead.
it's sort of like you're moving from a 10-gallon tank to a 12-gallon tank.
Is that also why it's important when you're doing these training rides, not necessarily to go to fast during the training rides, you're actually doing some adaptations during the training rides to increase your muscle glycogen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Did you have more slides to go over, Kathie? I just want to make sure we were.
Yeah. So you mentioned about fats.
Yep.
And, I don't want to say that fats aren't important because they are. But the reason that we don't focus so heavily on them is because there's not a potential to deplete your fat stores. And so, and Americans don't generally have an issue with getting adequate amounts of fat, it's sort of hidden everywhere. So we don't make a lot of focus on total fat. I think as a sports dietitian, where we try to focus is changing the type of fats that our athletes are consuming and steering them away from saturated fats, things found in butter and cheese and other dairy products and meats, and focusing more on what we like to call the healthy fats and things that are found in things like fish, right? So your unsaturated fats that are found in things like fish and vegetables, and whole grains, right? So particularly those essential fatty acids like the omega-6s and the omega-3s. And of those two groups of essential fatty acids, specifically the omega-3s, which are found in fish and nuts and seeds.
So getting back to losing weight, where Rick was talking about not eating on the bike. It seems like, and knowing how we burn fat, that if, as a cyclist, you want to lose weight, the real way to do it is to eat carbs, but train at the moderate, or ride a lot in the moderate place where we're burning more fat. And just burn and use that as the way to lose weight, the training and burning fat that way versus fasting on a bike.
Yes. Yes. And so one of the things that we would work with is, again, making sure that you're training at a moderate intensity, because as you very correctly identified, you want to be up in here, because here you're burning 50% of fat, 50% carbs, and at this moderate intensity, the total calories that you're burning is going to be way higher than here. People are like, oh, well, maybe I should just exercise at a really low intensity. It's like, well, you can, because you're burning maybe 90% fat, but 90% of 10 calories is 9 calories, right? Whereas 50% of 100 calories is 50 calories. So makes more sense to be in a more moderate category, more moderate intensity, right? So in the 60 to 70% of VO2 max, and then making sure that you have adequate carbohydrate availability without going overboard, because carbs are the preferred fuel. So if I'm in the moderate intensity and I'm providing lots of carbs, I'm still going to oxidize some fat, but my body's going to preferentially use carbs. If I provide just enough carbs so that I can stay in this moderate intensity, but not so much that I'm going to sacrifice my body saying, I still need to burn some fat, that's where we want to be. And that's why these ranges are so nice, because I can play with the range during exercise. And maybe if somebody's goal is to lose weight, we want to think about, instead of providing 60 grams per hour, maybe bring them down to 30 grams per hour. So we've got enough carbs to not sacrifice performance and still get to stay in the moderate intensity here. Sorry, my arrow's not working, but not providing too much that we're going to sacrifice our bodies wanting to use fat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So you really don't want to overdo. So if you're in the early season and you're trying to pull off the pounds, you really don't want to overdo the carbs.
Right.
You really need to say,
You don't want to underdo it either.
right. So kind of, you just have to kind of play with that, I guess. And going back to your first slide is, how am I feeling?
Yep.
To say, am I not getting enough carbs versus just enough to burn that fat for the ultimate goal, which is to be a little bit lighter when you're doing those climbs.
Yep.
So you kind of have to play with it, I think, and listen to your body.
Listen to your body. And that's where, if I can make a plug for working with a sports dietitian, that's where working with a sports dietitian is so important. I mean, just like, Oren is putting together this training program versus just saying, okay, you're going to do this 150-mile ride with these crazy elevation gains. Good luck, right? There's an actual physical training program that gets you. It's the same with nutrition. You really, if your goal is to try to lose some weight while not sacrificing performance, if your goal, I mean, we haven't even really talked about the day of, we'll save that for another podcast. But if your goal is to set a PR for yourself or improve upon your time from last year, working with a sports dietitian that can really dial this in and make this unique to you is going to be really important. So, because I was going to say, this looks simple. Maybe it doesn't look simple to most people. It's not simple. There is some nuances to it, and to really dial it in correctly to achieve maybe a loss of body weight while not sacrificing lean body mass, not sacrificing power, not negatively impacting performance. That's a real fine line. And a sports dietitian is going to be able to help you do that. I wouldn't suggest trying to do it on your own.
I think, different people have different motivations. I think, as we talked about, some folks from a RAMROD perspective, they want to just complete it. And that's, that's from their perspective, that's the goal that they're chasing. Some folks that have been doing it for several years may want to, have a PR up to inspiration point. So I think in a sense, everyone has kind of different goals. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of variables in a sense of, how to accomplish those goals.
Right.
Yep.
You asked about other slides, and so I did want to go through these because I think this will be helpful as well. So these are called the athlete's plates. I don't know, have any of you all ever seen these before? The athlete's plates.
I have not.
So they were actually created by a friend and colleague of mine, and they were created out of University of Colorado, and they were created for Olympic athletes. And the idea behind this, if you're familiar with my plate, which is it's the pictorial representation of the dietary guidelines for Americans, and it's based on a plate. These were tailored to athletes. So it was taking the USDA My Plate graphic and making it more applicable to athletes. And so it highlights an easy training day, a moderate training day, and a heavy training day. And one of the things that you'll notice as you go from easy, moderate to high is what's increasing is the carbs. So, and that's identified by the fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, which are your carbohydrate-rich foods, right? So you'll notice that the plate's getting expanding in those areas. So this is a nice sort of graphic or pictorial way to highlight the importance of increasing carbohydrates and that carbohydrate availability on moderate and heavy training days. And so it's sort of a great way to plan things out and look at it in terms of foods and what your plate should look like.
What's interesting I see is that protein quadrant doesn't change.
No. And here's the reason, Pam, because we tend to think in absolutes, right? That when we're looking at, I'm going to focus primarily on whole grains because fruits and vegetables, vegetables do contain some protein. Fruits don't contain much in the way of proteins, but vegetables, especially your starchy vegetables, like things like potatoes and peas and beans, beans are very protein rich, right? They get to play both sides. They're in the protein group as a plant-based protein, but they're also in the carb group. So when you increase your intake of whole grains and vegetables, particularly starchy vegetables, you are automatically increasing your protein. So you don't need to focus on increasing this area because you're already getting an increase in protein by increasing these foods.
Got it.
So for example, a piece of whole grain bread has 3 grams of protein. So if I go from 2 pieces with 6 grams of protein to 4 pieces, because I'm doing a hard training day, I've now doubled my protein intake just by increasing my carbs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why we don't need to increase this area, the protein area, because it's already increasing by increasing these areas.
And I don't do this, but I know a lot of athletes think they need protein shakes and that kind of thing. So to, increase their protein take. But if you do this plate, you don't really need the supplemental protein.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, there are some athletes that a protein supplement may be beneficial for, and those are people who, again, when we think back to evenly distributing our protein intake throughout the day, maybe for breakfast, I'm not going to sit down to eggs and yogurt and some toast or yogurt and some cereal. I really like to have more of a carb-rich breakfast, but I need to get some protein in there too. Maybe a protein shake to increase my protein intake at that meal will be helpful. So I think of protein supplements as more for convenience sake, and maybe not being able to meet my protein requirements through the food that I eat, and especially evenly distributing it throughout the day. So
yeah, I think that's an interesting topic. We're just talking about as we go through training is the recovery portion of it after, before you're eating, before the ride, during the ride, and then afterwards as you're training is like, what is the proper, in a sense, etiquette there or eating you should do post rides as well from a recovery perspective? Because obviously we hear a lot of protein shakes, a lot of recovery drinks after workouts.
yeah. So this is actually, I stole this right from the USDA from my plate. And again, this sort of highlights to you what these are calorie levels across the top. And these are just looking at servings from the different food groups, which you saw on the plate beforehand. So you can see the reason I bolded these is that for most people in the training phase, it could actually be higher than 3,200, but you're going to be in this higher range, especially on training days. So that's why I put that there. Just for one more graphic. And then, I don't know if you want to talk about hydration. Let me skip through that. This was a little graphic that I put together. You mentioned sort of, I think Oren mentioned that, okay, so we have our ride. And so, 2 to 4 hours before, we want to think about our breakfast, and that 2 grams per kilogram up to 4 grams per kilogram, depending on where we eat it. Maybe a snack beforehand, not necessary. And then during our ride, that 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And I also want to just mention where that 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour came from. We didn't just pull it out of thin air, but it has been shown that people can oxidize up to about 1 gram of carbohydrate. And when I say oxidize, I'm saying basically using it for fuel. So you're using 1 gram of carbohydrate per minute is sort of the maximum rate. So that's where we get that 30 to 60. And again, 30 to 60 because it's 1 gram per minute if I'm at that really high intensity where carbohydrate is the primary fuel. If I'm in a more moderate intensity where half of what I'm burning is fat and half of what I'm burning is carbs, then it's probably down around 30. And that's why I said, if you're training in that moderate intensity where half of what you're using is fat and half of carb, you can get away with 30 grams per hour because you're probably only using 30 grams or half a gram per minute, because the other half is coming from carb or fat, right? And then we haven't talked about recovery. Maybe we want to save that for another podcast.
I think it's just also important to know that, you know, individuals are different in a sense. I think there's been a lot of discussions about some of the recent Tour de France riders and how much they can carb or process carbs within an hour. And some of the numbers they're talking about is insane. So yes, I would say in this case it's individualized in terms of carbs per hour.
Yeah, and again, you know, I'm not talking about the Tour de France rider. That would be a different podcast. And different recommendations.
Yep. We were getting close on time. I just want to make sure you had enough, any other slides you want to
no, that's just me. So that was, and we didn't talk about hydration, but
do you want to quickly go over hydration? Because I think that's actually really important.
Sure. Yeah. So first thing I have here, so the slide has 2 things on it. Like I showed with signs of suboptimal fueling, here are some signs of suboptimal hydration. So if you've ever experienced any of these things, I think, you know, you can sort of think about that. One of the things that I've noticed in working with cyclists is it's not that I don't ever see dehydration with cyclists, but I don't see it as often with cyclists as I see with runners and triathletes. And triathletes because swimming and running is part of it. And so I tend to see more hydration issues with runners because it's harder to rehydrate on the run. You're at a greater risk of GI distress when you're running. It's not that I don't see dehydration on the bike, but I don't see it as often. So these are some of the signs and symptoms of suboptimal hydration. And then these are the general recommendations for fluid. You want to start your ride well hydrated, and that usually means 14 to 18 fluid ounces of fluid within about an hour to an hour and a half before your ride. And then it's really, you want to match your fluid intake to your fluid loss. And that's where it becomes somewhat challenging because everybody's sweat rates and fluid losses are different. They're all unique. And so you really, to get an optimal hydration strategy, you really should be measuring your fluid output on rides. And you can easily do this by weighing before and after your ride and look to see how much fluid you're losing. If you weigh before and after your rides and you're not losing any weight, then whatever your fluid replacement strategy is during your ride is probably spot on. So this 4 to 6 fluid ounces every 15 to 20 minutes is just, it really is very general and doesn't pertain to probably anybody. The best way to truly examine your fluid intake is to first look and see, do you experience any of these? If so, you may have a fluid intake problem. And then if you do experience this, weigh yourself before and after different rides, different duration, different intensities, and see if you're losing weight. If you're not losing weight, you're probably adequately hydrated.
This may be for another podcast as well, but what about electrolytes?
Yeah. So electrolytes are important, sodium being the most important. If you are consuming food during your ride to get your carbohydrate, then you're probably getting some sodium along with it. If not, you will want to make sure that your fluid contains some sodium as well. And most sports drinks do contain sodium, so you're probably fine. Again, where you'd want to look to see if you have issues is if you are experiencing some of these symptoms. If not, you're probably getting adequate sodium just based on your fluid and food replacement. So you definitely want to, especially for a longer than an hour ride, you want to make sure that whatever fluid you're consuming does contain electrolytes. So you probably wouldn't want to just do water unless whatever food you're consuming to get your carbs also contains sodium, right? So the reason that that's sort of a hard question to answer is it really depends on what are you using as your beverage.
Yep.
Are you using a sports drink that contains electrolytes? If so, then you're probably fine. Unless you're a really salty sweater and you've had issues with sodium in the past, whatever electrolytes are in your sports drink are probably adequate to meet, plus whatever food you're consuming is probably adequate to meet your sodium levels. If all you're drinking is water, then you want to look to see what type of sodium you're getting in the food that you're eating to match to get your carbohydrates. So you just kind of have to play it that way.
This has been great, Kathie. I think we're actually out of time. Do you have any contact information if people want to get a hold of you and ask
Yes.
questions?
So there is my contact information. That's the best email to reach me, and email is best. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathie. Thank you, Pam and Oren.
Very
just remind-
informative. Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for folks, RAMROD Training Series is on. You can check us out at the Facebook page, RAMROD Training Series. You can also go to redmondcycling.club to get more information about the club, RAMROD, and our organized rides. With that, I want to thank Pam, Kathie, and Oren for the time.
Thank you.
And thank you for putting it together.